There is a rule at Meridian General's trauma ward that every nurse learns on their first shift and never forgets. What you see in Bay 7, you carry to your grave. No names. No faces remembered. No whispered conversations at the nurse's station about the man with 4 bodyguards and a bullet the attending physician was too afraid to remove. Denny Jane had kept that rule for 6 years. 6 years of stitching up wounds she wasn't supposed to ask about. 6 years of swallowing questions whole. 6 years of understanding that in this city, the line between a patient and a predator was often just a hospital gown and a morphine drip. She was good at silence. What she was not good at, what had always been her most inconvenient quality, the thing her grandmother back in Port of Spain used to call her beautiful, terrible curse, was indifference. And the man they wheeled into Bay 7 on the coldest Thursday in November was the kind of broken that made indifference impossible. It was her grandmother's birthday. The woman had been dead for 3 years, but Denny still marked the day the same way: a single glass of sorrel left on the breakroom counter, a quiet song hummed under her breath between rounds, and the particular weight she carried in her chest that no amount of clinical training had ever taught her to set down. She was in the middle of that quiet weight when the bay doors crashed open. GSW to the left shoulder, possible fractured orbital, lacerations to the jaw and neck. He was conscious on the way in but. Get me Dr. Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove is unavailable. A beat of silence that said everything. Denny looked up from her chart. There were 4 men in dark suits forming a wall around the gurney, and each of them had the particular stillness of people who had made very permanent decisions about other people before. The attending on call, Dr. Fennick, who had 17 years of experience and an impeccable record, was standing 3 feet from the patient and showing no signs of moving closer. She understood immediately. The man on the gurney was not a man you approached without permission. His face was a ruin on the left side, jaw swollen, a deep gash running from his cheekbone toward his neck with the kind of precision that said this was not an accident, this was a message. His suit, what remained of it, was black and clearly expensive, now soaked through on one side with the particular dark red that Denny's hands knew better than her own heartbeat. His eyes were closed. And yet somehow, even shattered and unconscious, he held himself like a man who had never once, in his entire life, asked anyone for help. Denny set down her chart. She pulled on fresh gloves. She walked to Bay 7 while every other person in that corridor suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. One of the suited men stepped forward. She looked at him the way her grandmother used to look at storms rolling in from the Gulf, with full recognition and zero fear. "I'm his nurse," she said, in a tone that did not invite debate. "Unless one of you has a medical degree hidden under that jacket, I suggest you give me 2 feet of space." They gave her 3. She leaned over the man with the ruined face and began her assessment with steady hands, and because she was alone, and because she thought he couldn't hear her, and because it was her grandmother's birthday and grief makes people honest, she began to talk. Not to the room. Not to the monitors. To him. In the soft, rolling cadence of Trinidadian Creole that she hadn't spoken aloud since the funeral, she told him that his orbital wasn't fractured, badly bruised, but intact. She told him that whoever had worked on him before this had made a mess of the shoulder. She told him that she was going to fix it, whether he wanted her to or not, because that was the deal. You ended up on her table, she brought you back. "So don't even think about dying on me," she murmured, threading a suture with the ease of long practice. "I didn't put on a double shift for that." She didn't see his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She didn't see the way the faintest line appeared between his brows, not from pain, but from something that had no business being on the face of a man in his condition. Something that looked, improbably, like he was listening. 1 year later, Denny Jane would walk into a restaurant in an emerald sequined dress and find that same man sitting at a table while a woman in red laughed at him. She would not stand for it. She would lean down, press her lips to his forehead, slow, deliberate, in front of God and everyone, rest her hand on his shoulder with the quiet authority of a woman who had already pulled this man back from the edge once before. And she would call him darling. The woman in red would stop laughing. Lee Song would open his eyes. And everything would change. Speech Balloon, subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. He had no name when they brought him in. The intake form said John Doe, The way it always did when the men carrying the patient looked like they ironed their grief into their suits. Denny had filled out enough of those forms to know that John Doe was just bureaucracy's polite way of saying don't ask. She didn't ask. She worked. The orbital was intact, she had been right about that in the first frantic assessment, but the shoulder was another matter entirely. Whoever had attempted to clean the wound before arrival had done so with the kind of confidence that competence does not produce, and Denny spent the better part of an hour undoing that damage before she could begin doing anything useful. The laceration along his jaw was deep and deliberate, the kind of mark left by someone making a point rather than simply causing harm. She closed it in careful, even sutures, each one placed with the precision her grandmother had always called her real mother tongue, not words, but hands. The bay was quiet except for the monitors and the low, particular hum of a hospital at 3 in the morning, that frequency between emergency and exhaustion where everything felt suspended. And so she talked. She hadn't meant to. It started as a murmur, the same way her grandmother's prayers had started, not addressed to anyone exactly, just released into the air because keeping them inside took too much energy when your hands were already working. She slipped into Creole the way she always did when she was tired enough to stop performing composure, the syllables soft and familiar in her mouth like something she had been holding all day. She told him his blood pressure was stabilizing. She told him the shoulder would ache for weeks and that he should listen to whatever physician eventually properly saw him, in a real clinical setting, not this shadow theater they were all performing tonight. She told him that the scar on his jaw would be visible but clean, and that clean scars had a kind of dignity to them if you let them. You go be all right, she said quietly, snipping the final suture thread. Whether you want to or not. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to the inside of his wrist, a habit, a check, something steadying for her as much as clinical, and that was when she felt it. The almost imperceptible shift in his breathing. Not distress. Not the random fluctuation of sedation. Deliberate. She looked at his face. His eyes were still closed. His expression had not changed. He was, by every measurable indicator, an unconscious man. But the line of his jaw had softened by some fraction she could not have explained in a chart note, and Denny Jane, who had learned to read bodies the way other people read text, stood very still for one long moment before she removed her fingers from his wrist, gathered her instruments, and said nothing else for the rest of her shift. He was gone by morning. Not discharged. Not transferred. The bed was simply empty when she came back after 2 hours of sleep in the break room, the sheets pulled with a neatness that suggested whoever had left had done so with full consciousness and the muscle memory of someone accustomed to disappearing cleanly. Dr. Fenwick did not mention it. The suited men were gone. The intake form had been filed and would, Denny suspected, find its way into whatever administrative purgatory the hospital reserved for nights it preferred not to remember. She stood at the empty bed for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she began to strip it for the next patient, and her hand found the lighter tucked beneath the pillow. Small, matte black, heavier than it looked. On its face, a crest she didn't recognize, angular, deliberate, the kind of mark that belonged to something larger than one man. She should have logged it. Should have handed it to the charge nurse, let it disappear into the lost and found. She put it in her pocket instead. She told herself it was unfinished business. The clinical kind. The kind where a patient leaves before you can confirm they understand their discharge instructions, and something in your professional conscience nags at you until you close the loop. She was experienced enough to know that was not entirely the truth. But she was also practical enough to keep moving. A year passed the way years do when you are busy, in pieces, in shifts, in the accumulation of small moments that only reveal their shape when you look back at them from a distance. Denny finished her postgraduate certification. She moved to a slightly larger apartment. She kept the lighter on her nightstand without examining too closely why she did. She was not waiting. She was certain of that. She was simply unresolved. It was a Thursday again when everything changed, because the universe, Denny had begun to suspect, had a limited imagination when it came to timing. She had agreed to dinner with colleagues at Aurum, the kind of restaurant where the lighting was engineered to make everyone look like the best version of themselves and the menu had no prices because the prices were not the point. She wore the emerald dress because it was the only thing in her wardrobe equal to the occasion, sequined, fitted, the green so saturated against her dark skin that she had paused in front of her mirror for a moment before leaving, something settling in her chest like an answer to a question she hadn't asked aloud. She saw him before she heard the commotion. Lee Song, though she did not know his name yet, would not know it for another hour, was sitting at a table near the center of the room with the posture of a man who had built a fortress out of his own stillness. The black suit. The jaw she had sutured with her own hands, now bearing the clean, healed scar she had predicted. He was holding a small box, and across from him sat a woman in a red dress who was not holding it, who would in fact never hold it, because the sound that carried across the ambient noise of crystal and conversation was unmistakably laughter. Not the generous kind. The table nearest them had gone quiet. Then the next one. The silence moved outward from that woman's laughter like a stone dropped in still water, and Denny watched Lee Song's expression do something she recognized from the trauma bay, that precise, controlled closing down of the face, the composure that was not peace but its performance. She was out of her seat before she had made a decision. She was aware, distantly, of her colleagues calling after her. She was aware of the Maître D tracking her movement with professional anxiety. She was aware of the woman in red looking up with the particular expression of someone who has been enjoying an audience and does not appreciate an interruption. Denny did not stop. She walked to Lee Song's table, and she leaned down, and she pressed her lips to his forehead slowly, with full deliberateness, with the unhurried authority of a woman who had already decided this was the right thing and did not require the room's opinion on the matter. Her hand rested on his shoulder. She could feel the faint tension in him, the coiled stillness of someone who had not been touched gently in a very long time and did not know what to do with it. "Sorry I'm late, darling," she said, and her voice carried just enough for the immediate audience without performing for the whole room. She straightened and looked at the woman in red with the calm expression her grandmother had reserved for things that were not worth raising her voice over. The woman in red closed her mouth. The box disappeared into Lee Song's jacket pocket. And when Denny finally looked down at him, his eyes were open, dark, precise, and fixed on her with an attention so complete it felt almost physical, and for just a moment, beneath the composure and the scar and everything the world had made of him, she saw the same thing she had felt at 3 in the morning with 2 fingers on his wrist. He remembered her too. She had half expected him to vanish again. It seemed to be his established pattern. He did not vanish. He found her 2 days later outside Meridian General, at 7:45 in the morning, standing beside a car that cost more than her apartment and wearing an expression that suggested he had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and discarded all of them. She stopped walking. He said, without preamble, "Why did you do that?" She considered him. The scar. The suit. The 4 men at a respectful distance who were pretending very hard to be lamp posts. "Which part?" she asked. "The stitches or the restaurant?" Something moved briefly across his face. "Both." She shifted her bag on her shoulder. "The stitches were my job. The restaurant," she paused, looking for the honest answer rather than the convenient one. "That woman was being unkind in public. I find that difficult to watch." She was being honest, he said, and there was no self-pity in it, which made it worse somehow. "About what I am. What you are," Denny said, "is a man who needed 12 sutures on his jaw and had the good sense to hold still while I placed them. Everything else is a conversation for another time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, she ran. Denny waited. "The woman in red. She left because she was afraid of who I am." "You," he stopped. Recalibrated. "You stayed. At the hospital. You didn't ask questions. You didn't." "I'm a nurse," she said simply. "Staying is the job." "It's not," he said, and the precision of it, 2 words, delivered without drama, made her understand that he knew exactly what most people did when they found themselves in Bay 7 with the knowledge of who was in the bed. "It isn't. And you know it isn't." She held his gaze. "No," she admitted. "It isn't." He nodded, once, as if she had confirmed something he'd spent a year calculating. "I owe you a debt," he said. "You don't," she said. "I do," he said. "And I pay my debts." She almost smiled at that. "Then buy me dinner. We'll call it even." He did not buy her dinner. He drove her, in a car with tinted windows and a silence that was surprisingly comfortable, To a lookout point above the eastern ridge that had no signage and 2 security cameras she clocked immediately and chose not to comment on. The city spread below them in the early evening like something a person could almost believe was peaceful from a sufficient distance. They sat on the hood of the car because she had said the interior felt like a conversation that was trying too hard, and he had, after a pause she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine consideration, agreed. She had the lighter in her bag. She wasn't sure why she'd brought it. Some instinct she was still in the process of examining. "You've been to this spot before," she said. Not a question. "Yes. Often." A pause. "Every week for the past year." She looked at him. "Your building is visible from the north face," he said, and his voice was entirely level, which was the only reason she understood he was not saying it casually. "The 3rd floor. Your apartment faces east." The silence that followed was the kind that required very careful handling. "You've been watching my apartment," she said slowly. "I've been watching over it," he said. The distinction, clearly, mattered to him. "After the hospital, there were people who knew you'd treated me. People who might have considered that a liability. I needed to know you were safe." She turned this over. The clinical part of her brain ran a quick and thorough assessment of whether she should be frightened. It returned an answer she found genuinely inconvenient. "For a year," she said. "Yes. You watched over my apartment for a year and never." "You were fine," he said. "You didn't need me to introduce myself into your life. You were fine. You were good." The last word came out slightly differently from the others, with a care that suggested he did not use it often. "I wasn't going to disrupt that. And the restaurant. I didn't know you'd be there." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the city. Then she reached into her bag and set the lighter on the hood between them. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of something he had written off as lost. "You kept it," he said. "Unfinished business," she said. "I told myself." He picked it up. Turned it once in his hands. And for the first time since she had known him across a trauma bay, across a restaurant, across this strange and careful distance, Lee Song looked at her without any composure at all. Just a man on a car hood above a city that didn't deserve the view, holding something small that someone had kept for him without being asked. "Unfinished business," he repeated quietly. "Yes," Denny Jane said, and did not look away. "I think so." She learned about the tattoos the way she learned most things about Lee Song, not because he offered the information, but because circumstances made concealment impractical. They had been meeting for 3 weeks by then. Not dates, exactly, neither of them had used that word, operating instead in the comfortable ambiguity of 2 people who understood each other's rhythms well enough to stop pretending the meetings were accidental. Coffee at a place he'd vetted for exits. A walk along the waterfront at an hour when most of the city was still sleeping. The lookout point twice more, where they had developed the particular ease of people who have decided, without announcement, to trust each other. She was reaching across the center console to return his jacket. She'd borrowed it against the night air when his sleeve pulled back, and the ink began. It didn't stop. She had seen tattoos before. This was different. This was cartography. The lines ran from his wrist upward in a language she didn't speak but could feel the weight of, a system of marks that spoke of allegiance and hierarchy and debts of a kind that made her hospital's John Doe policy look almost quaint by comparison. A dragon coiled along his forearm with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. Beneath it, older marks, the kind that had been placed before the finer work, with less artistry and more necessity. She didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked. The jacket still in her hand. "You have questions," he said. "I have approximately 40, she said. "But I'm a nurse. I'll start with the one that matters. Does any of it cause you pain?" He turned to look at her with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of being completely disarmed. "No." "Good," she said, and handed him the jacket. He was still deciding what to do with her, she could see that. Had been able to see it since the car hood above the city when the door on her side opened. Not because she had touched the handle. The man outside was one of the 4 she had mentally catalogued as lampposts, and his face was saying something his voice was not yet articulating, which in Denny's clinical experience meant the situation had already progressed past the point where words were the most urgent priority. "Sir," he said, and that was all he needed to say. Lee moved. The unhurried authority of it was something she had not yet seen at full velocity. She had seen the stillness, the controlled composure, but this was what lived underneath it, and it was significant. He had her door closed and the car in motion before she had fully processed the sequence, and somewhere in the dark behind them something made a sound that she categorized as a firearm and filed away in the part of herself that was still performing clinical detachment. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No. Are you?" "No." "Then drive," she said. "And when we get wherever we're going, you're going to explain to me what 40 questions worth of your life actually looks like." He drove. And later, in a safe house that smelled of cedar and had better medical supplies than she'd expected, he did. He was shot 6 weeks after that. Not in front of her, she was grateful for that. In the complicated way she had learned to be grateful for the specific mercy of not witnessing things she could not have prevented. He arrived at her door at 2 in the morning, which was becoming a recurring theme in their association, this time with one of his men supporting his right side and an entry wound below his ribs that someone had already packed but not properly assessed. There was another man inside the apartment already. She had stopped being startled by this, who introduced himself as the doctor Lee's organization retained and immediately began setting out instruments with a confidence she recognized as the specific dangerous kind that comes from never having been genuinely questioned. "No," she said. The doctor looked up. "I'm sorry." I said no. She set down the bag she used for exactly this kind of situation. She had assembled it 3 weeks ago, after the car, because she was practical and she had stopped pretending to herself that practicality wasn't a form of caring. "Sit down or leave. Either works for me." Lee, who was upright through what appeared to be pure will, made a sound that might have been her name. "Sit," she told him too, in the tone she reserved for patients who were about to make poor decisions. "And don't be impressive. It's not helping either of us right now." He sat a day. The retained doctor sat too, in the end, watching her work with an expression that moved through indignation and arrived, reluctantly, at something closer to respect. The wound was manageable, deep but clean, nothing critical compromised, the kind of injury that was dangerous primarily if handled incorrectly, which she did not intend to do. She worked in the familiar quiet of her own competence, and Lee Song held still with the same deliberateness she had first noticed in Bay 7, and the city outside continued its indifferent business. And when she was finished she pressed 2 fingers briefly to his wrist, the old habit, and felt his pulse steady and strong beneath them. His hand came up and covered hers. Just for a moment. Then he let go. "You have to stop getting shot," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. The gala was his associate's event, a charity function of the kind the city's powerful used to launder their public image, and Lee had been required to attend. Denny had not been required, but she had come because she had decided, somewhere between the safe house and the 6th week of this strange careful life they were building, that required and chosen were different categories and she was done confusing them. She wore the emerald dress again. She saw the woman in red, whose name she had since learned was Vivienne, a detail she stored without particular feeling, approximately 40 minutes into the evening, moving through the room with the purposeful social navigation of someone who had an objective. Denny tracked her the way she tracked anything in an environment she was still assessing, and she was not surprised when Vivienne arrived beside the wife of a hospital board member and began a conversation that had the particular intimate architecture of gossip being carefully planted. She caught her own name once. Inappropriate. The shape of the word, even at distance, was unmistakable. Lee was at her elbow before she could move. "Don't," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to do anything," she said. "I know that expression," he said. "You're about to do something efficient." "Efficient isn't the word I'd have chosen." She straightened the line of her dress. "Stay here." She moved through the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who understood that social situations, like trauma bays, rewarded composure over speed. She reached the board member's wife, Dr. Celestine Okafor, whom Denny had known professionally for 4 years and personally for 2, and whose daughter Denny had sat with through a difficult night in the pediatric ward, and she touched her arm lightly, smiled, and said simply, "Dr. Okafor. I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. How is Amora doing?" The warmth that crossed Dr. Okafor's face was entirely genuine. They talked for 6 minutes, and in those 6 minutes Denny allowed the conversation to establish, naturally and without theater, Exactly who she was, her work, her reputation, the kind of presence she occupied in that city's medical community. Not defensively. Not in response to anything. Simply the truth, offered into the room with the ease of someone who has never needed to argue for their own character because their character speaks. Vivienne stood beside this and had nothing to add. When Denny moved away, she heard Dr. Okafor say something warm about her to the woman beside her. She did not look back. Lee was waiting where she'd left him. Efficient, he said. Trinidadian, she corrected, and took his arm, and he laughed, a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind she had been slowly accumulating like rare currency. He took her to the beach at the end of October. Not a dressed beach, not somewhere the city had managed and curated. A stretch of dark sand at the edge of something that felt like the actual edge of the world, where the waves made their argument against the shore with the patience of things that operate on geological time, and the sky was so complete with stars it seemed almost excessive. She had not asked where they were going. She had simply come. They walked for a while in the particular comfortable silence that had become the signature of everything between them, not the silence of people with nothing to say but of people who have said enough that silence has become another form of conversation. The water was cold where it reached their feet. She had taken off her shoes somewhere. She thought he probably had security in the tree line and decided she could live with that. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He did not go down on one knee. She would think about that later, how right that felt, not because the gesture wasn't in him, but because what he was about to say was not the kind of thing that needed staging. He simply turned to her, and he held out the ring in his open palm, and the moonlight was sufficient. It was not a spectacular ring. She registered this and loved him slightly more for it. Simple. Considered. The kind of object that said I thought about you specifically rather than I thought about impressiveness. I've been alone for a long time, he said. I told myself it was safer. For me. For anyone who might, he stopped. Recalibrated, the way he always did when language didn't immediately cooperate. I've spent a year watching your window from a ridge and telling myself I was paying a debt. I think you probably knew that was a lie before I did. Probably, she said quietly. I'm not asking you to be safe, he said. I can't promise you safe. I can promise you that I will spend whatever I have making sure that my world doesn't touch the parts of you that need protecting. And I can promise you, his voice did something she had never heard it do before, a slight unsteadiness, quickly steadied. That I will be a place you can come back to. Whatever that costs me. The waves continued their argument with the shore. Lee, she said. Yes. You watched my apartment for a year. Yes. And you learned nursery rhymes in Creole too. She stopped because she was smiling and it was interrupting the words. I didn't say that, he said carefully. Your associate told me. A pause. My associate talks too much. He does, she agreed. She took the ring from his palm. Yes, she said, and put it on herself because she was Denny Jane and she had always been better at practical action than waiting. Obviously yes. He exhaled. The longest exhale she had ever heard from him, as if he had been holding it for a year and a ridge and 6 weeks of careful evenings and all the rest of it. She pressed her hand flat against his chest and felt his heart. Steady. Strong. There, she said softly. That's the one I fixed. They married in May, when the city was doing its best impression of something worth celebrating. It was not a large wedding. Lee Song did not do large in the sentimental sense, and Denny Jane had always believed that the size of a celebration was inversely related to the certainty of the people inside it. What it was precise, the people who mattered, a garden with good light, a ceremony short enough that no one had time to perform feeling rather than have it. She wore white that had a warmth to it, cream at the edges, because she was a practical woman who understood that pure white was an argument with reality. He wore black, because some things were simply true about a person. After, in the quiet of the evening when the guests had gone and they were alone in the way that newlyweds are alone, completely, with the particular weight of a future that has just become specific, he said something she had not expected. "I've been practicing," he said. She looked at him. He said, in the careful, slightly formal Creole of a man who had learned something in a language that was not his own, "Do, sleep now. The stars watching over you." She was quiet for so long that he became uncertain, which was something she had never seen on him before. "Where did you learn that?" she whispered. "It was your grandmother's," he said. "You sang it to me. In the hospital. When you thought I couldn't hear." The thing she had suspected for a year and a half settled into certainty with the gentleness of something that was always going to be true. "You heard everything," she said. "Everything," he said. She looked at this man, the scars and the ink and the stillness and the terrible, careful love he had built around her like a structure that had no name yet, and she thought about her grandmother's birthday, and the sorrel on the break-room counter, and the particular weight she used to carry in her chest that had been, she understood now, simply room she had been making. "Learn the second verse," she said. "We're going to need it." He looked at her with the question. She smiled, and let the answer arrive in its own time, and outside the May city continued in its noise and its difficulty and its complete indifference, and inside this one room, the boss of the underworld committed quietly to learning nursery rhymes. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.